A Day with Squirrels, A Tale from the Other Side of the Mountain by Joseph Moyers. April 30th, 2020. Golden sunlight streamed through the streaked glass of the trailer's window, revealing years of grime etched into its surface. The sudden brilliance lit up the room and created a dull rose-colored image through Roy's eyelids. He rolled over in his small metal-framed bed to face away from the window. He adjusted his pillow and pulled his blanket tighter against his chin to ward off the chill in the air. As sunlight continued to permeate the dirty window, the room became brighter through the chill in the air that didn't subside. Roy rolled back over, squinted into the sunlight, and swung his legs out of bed, ready for the day's work. His thought wandered about the fact that work never truly was complete on the farm, just delayed till a future date when it was to be repeated. Roy sat up in his bed for a moment, pushing back the colorful, homemade comforter his grandmother had stitched, the patterns now worn but cherished. He then spun around and placed his socked feet on the ragged rug laid along the floor at the side of his bed. He noticed his pinky toe sticking out and made a note to repair the hole later. Maybe it was time for a new pair of socks. However, that would have to wait till there was money from the lambs later in the spring. Roy flexed his toes against the cold air before slipping them into his scuffed boots, which bore the marks of many seasons on the farm. He then tied the strings tight and stood up. Roy stretched again, this time a bit longer to get the kinks out of his back. He stepped over to the old wood stove and held his hand over the top. No heat emanated from it, so Roy unlatched the rusty stove door, a relic of the farm's past, and peered inside. A few embers still held a dull rust color, so he knelt, leaned forward, and softly blew on them. The embers glowed slightly, and he saw a few sparks rise and instantly vanish. He reached for a few small pieces of wood and lay them against the embers. He then moved them around a bit to push the ashes back. The jagged edges of the smaller kindling made the fire dance, and Roy gave them more fuel by adding a few larger chunks of axe-cut wood. The fire began to greedily bite at the new logs, and heat built enough to push a gust of hot air against Roy's face. He then closed the door of the store tightly and adjusted a few of the various vents to allow better airflow and feed the fire further. Roy stood up and picked up the metal coffee. He removed the lid and filled it half full with water from the bucket sitting on the counter. Roy replaced the cap and set the pot on top of the wood stove. A few drops of water splashed on the stove and disappeared in a waft of steam. Roy poured the rest of the water from the bucket into the sink and headed toward the trailer door. He placed the bucket while he put on a thick jacket and cap. Roy picked up the bucket, opened the door, and stepped outside. On the stoop, he looked around and saw the colorful leaves of deep fall. The large hickory tree sat just yards from the trailer and towered over him, casting a long, early morning shadow westward. He looked that direction and headed to the spring for some fresh water. The soft ground gave a bit with each of Roy's heavy-booted steps. The path was well-worn, dipped up and down over the uneven ground. He passed the large cast-iron pot used to cook sugar and took note to check the maple trees and see if sap was ready to be harvested. Roy gingerly stepped onto the split-log bridge, allowing passage over the swift-running creek. He gingerly crossed to the other side and soon stood overlooking the small spring. He opened the wooden box that acted as a cooler and checked the articles there. A few beers and a plastic container of cheese sat in the frigid cold of the spring water. A few native fish darted across the water, and even during this time of year the crest was deep green and fresh. Roy pulled out his knife and cut a bunch for later in day. He removed the ladle and dipped the bucket into the spring, filling it to the brim. Roy dipped the ladle into the bucket and took a long sip of the cold water. It was refreshing and made him feel satisfied with life. He replaced the ladle, lowered the bucket, and started his return to the trailer to get breakfast started. Roy placed the full bucket on the counter next to the sink. He stepped over to the bin and pulled a few of the dirty potatoes out. Many had long yellowish stalks from their eyes. This would be good for the spring, but now they were just trash to be cut and added to the mulch pit. Roy washed each off and brushed off the eye stalks. He then peeled the potatoes and cut them into nice, even slices and placed them in a small plate. Roy pulled a stick of butter from the small electric refrigerator, sliced a chunk off, and placed it into the large skillet sitting on the wood stove beside the coffee pot. He added the potato slices and stirred them with a wooden spoon. Roy then opened the coffee pot lid and added 2 scoops of ground coffee. He then sat down to wait for breakfast to be cooked. Roy checked on the potatoes by flipping them over with a metal spatula. The edges were crisp with gold coloring. He cracked the shell of a brown egg with one hand and spread the egg across the potatoes. Roy then broke the yolk with the edge of the spatula and mixed it along with the whites with the potatoes until they were evenly spread. He watched over the skillet for a few minutes, occasionally flipping the contents, until the eggs were thoroughly cooked. Roy poured the mixed contents onto a plate, tossed the skillet into the sink, grabbed 2 slices of bread and some butter, placing them on the plate as well. He put the plate filled with food onto the table and poured himself a full cup of black coffee. Roy sat down to enjoy his breakfast as sunshine continued to fill the trailer from the western window, adding its heat along with that of the wood stove. Roy felt full, pushed his chair back from the table, and stood up. He placed the silverware and the empty coffee cup on the plate, walked over to the sink, and placed the plate inside. He then rinsed out the coffee cup with a bit of the fresh spring water. Roy put on his jacket and picked up the old paint bucket he used for dog food. He placed a scoop of dog food with the bits of food scraps in the slop bucket. Stepping outside, Roy was greeted by the crisp morning air and the chorus of barking from the row of dog houses down the path. The beagles barked loudly, and he approached, knowing it was time for food. Roy ruffled each dog's ears as he poured out their food, their eager tails thumping against the wooden posts. Once all the food was gone, he then filled the empty bucket sitting there with fresh creek water and filled their water bowls. Roy released one of the dogs, named Queeny, and returned to the trailer with the empty slop bucket. Queeny followed closely behind him, giving yelps of joy bouncing up and down around Roy's feet. Roy opened the trailer door, stepped inside, and placed the scrap bucket beside the door. He pulled a 12-gauge shotgun from the rack and grabbed a box of shells. He placed the shells in his jacket pocket and the shotgun under his right arm. Roy stepped back outside the trailer, reached down to pat Queeny, and started walking towards the field full of hickory trees. The dirt path was dappled with sunlight, drying under the climbing sun, though stray clouds draped the holler in fleeting patches of shadow. 10 minutes later, Roy arrived at the field and walked over to one of the stumps that lay on the ground. Roy set the stump up, brushed off some of the dirt, and sat down. He laid the shotgun on his lap and reached into his pocket and pulled out a can of square snuff. Roy put pinch of snuff in his cheek, move it around a bit with his tongue, and spat on the ground. He then loaded his shotgun and looked up into the trees. Leaves of crimson, gold, and fiery orange spiraled down from the towering hickory trees, painting the ground in autumn's vivid palette. A few gray squirrels scampered along the highest limbs. Many were too far away or too small to worry with. Roy spat out a large gob of black liquid, and it splashed widely on the leaf-covered ground. He saw a rather large fox squirrel on the nearest tree and took aim slowly. Roy had the squirrel in his sight, took a slow breath, and pulled the trigger. The recoil rocked him back a bit on the stump, and he watched as the fox squirrel fell from the tree. Other squirrels scampered up their trees, and several birds flew from the nearby brush. An eerie silence fell over the field as Roy lowered his shotgun and placed it back on his lap. Queeny ran over to the squirrel, grabbed it in her mouth, and returned to Roy's side. She dropped the squirrel at Roy's feet and promptly lay back down to wait her next call to duty. Minutes passed before the sound of the field returned to normal. A few of the squirrels barked at each other across the treetops, and they jumped across limbs and began to play again. Roy could see a few on the ground gathering nuts and carrying them up to their nests. As an opportunity presented itself, he would shoot the larger squirrels. Roy looked down and counted 5 plump squirrels laid at his feet. He reached over and patted Queeny one more time for good luck. At that moment, a rather large gray squirrel scampered down along the bark of one of the hickories. Roy raised his shotgun, took aim, and once again pulled the trigger. Queeny launched towards the kill before it had time to hit the ground or the noise of the shotgun to dissipate. Roy stood up, spat out the last bit of snuff from his lip, and stretched his back. Queeny returned with the 6th squirrel, and Roy gave her a pat. He then gathered all the squirrels and placed them in the back pocket of his jacket. Roy placed his shotgun under his arm and started to walk back to the trailer. A few steps away, he turned to see Queeny still sitting at the hickory stump as in anticipation of more hunting. Roy slapped the side of his leg and called for Queeny. She instantly ran over to him and together they walked up the dirt path. Only the sound of their footsteps and birds in the distance could be heard. Overhead, the sun was lowering toward the western ridgeline. Roy walked casually up the small incline of the main road, topped the crest after a few moments, and then began the downhill walk to the trailer. Queeny ran back and forth with an energy pent up from the day's hunt and her many moments of sitting at Roy's side. Back at the trailer, Roy set up his station, stringing the squirrels along the old wooden rail in preparation for skinning. He tied up Queeny and patted her for a few minutes to thank her for the company of the day. Roy returned to the string of squirrels and pulled out a large pocket knife. He spent a few minutes sharpening the knife on a small grinding stone, spitting on it from time to time to help the sharpening process. After moving the knife across the stone in circular motions for some time, he tested the blade against the face of his left thumb. Roy took the first squirrel in his hands, the knife steady in his grip as he made a precise incision along its belly, peeling back the skin with practiced care. He peeled back the skin and then reached in and removed all the entrails. Roy tossed these parts into one of the small metal tubs at his feet. He then removed the feet and head, cut more slices in the animal's skin, and peeled it back until it reached the base of the long tail. With the skin pulled clean and the entrails discarded, Roy placed the dressed squirrel into the waiting tub, already reaching for the next. After all the animals were properly skinned, all that remained were their entrails in one metal tub, their skins on the leaf-littered ground, and their tails still swinging in the air. He wiped off his knife with a few autumn leaves and placed it back into his pocket. Roy picked up the bowl of entrails and tossed the contents across the rail fence. He then laid the skins on one of the rails with the first side down for drying. Roy then picked up the other metal tub with the 6 squirrels and took them inside the trailer. Once inside, he put a few ladles of spring water into the tub and rinsed off the squirrels. Roy took one of large kitchen knives and cut the animals into parts and put them into a large pot. He then filled the pot with water and placed it on the wood stove. Roy opened the front of the stove, stuck the poker in and moved the embers around, and then added more chunks of wood. He then moved back to the cutting board and chopped up some vegetables to include carrots and onions for his stew. Roy used another knife and sliced the vegetables into medium-sized chunks and put them in the pot along with the squirrel meat. He then added a few spices and salt, then stirred the contents, and then placed a lid on it to let the squirrel stew begin to cook. Once the water began to boil, Roy removed the lid and stirred the stew a few times. He then laid down on his bed, turned on the radio, and closed his eyes listening to the news and smelling the cooking stew. An hour later, Roy got up from his bed and stepped over to the wood stove. He looked at the stew and a sudden hunger hit him at the combined sight and smell waiting in the air. He stirred the stew one more time, grabbed a large ceramic bowl, and dished some stew into it. He then placed it on the table along with a half loaf of bread and butter. Roy took a soup spoon in his right hand and dipped it into the stew for his first taste. This short story is dedicated to my grandfather, Roy Edward Moyers, and his life and experience shared. I learned many things from this man and will not forget his legacy and simple lessons that have shaped my life.